Hi, this is Richard with Folks for Good Housing. Thanks for joining us for this encore presentation of our Housing 101 conference. Please keep in mind as we work our way through this that we are all just volunteers putting in our times in the evenings to do this type of presentation.
This is actually, let me grab this. Next series of about 10, 15 slides is actually going to be the work of Folks for Good Housing. We started off with this mission, which was, why does Winston-Salem have a housing issue? And it seems like a really simple question, and it's something that a lot of times we have meetings and they take 5 minutes to talk about housing, and everybody walks out and and that's part of the mission of this, was for us to start spending some time to actually talk about housing issues, not just kind of say we have a housing issue, but to say we have the following housing issue. How do we address it? So what we did was we started saying, one, we've had a series of reports, and I think a lot of folks who are in this room know about all these reports, where we hire groups. They spend 2 years interviewing everybody in the community. They come up with statistics. They come up with these great plans. They have a stack of, an inch or thick book, and nobody ever reads it. And somebody reads the summary, but nothing happens. So we basically said, okay, let's do our own study. Let's come up with our own way to look at this. And so we came up with kind of the top 8 or 10 different items of what are happening out there in the community. Number one, which is just a basic, which is we have a lot more people living in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County than we did 10 years ago. We have a ton more than we had in the 1970s. So as the housing's been changing, we've been seeing this. This is just the last 10 years. We have 84,000 new people living in Forsyth County. If you think about that, that's like the city of Statesville, which is 25,000. That's 3 Statesvilles worth of people living in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County that moved here in the last 10 years. That basically represents about 14,000 houses or housing units. There's a couple different 14,000s you'll hear out there in the marketplace. There's a 14,000, which is the number of folks who are living in housing and spending more than 30% of their income for their housing, which is affordable housing issue. That's just happens to be the same number as the 14,000 households that we've grown. And they're not directly related in that sense. Actually, can you move the chat up to the top? Thanks. Traditionally, about a third of housing is rental housing, which is apartments, townhouses, and houses. That's rentals. The other 2/3 historically has been single-family housing. It's actually changed from that, but just making that assumption, that means we would need, just for the growth we've had in the last 10 years, we need 4,600 new renting apartments. We also need 9,400 houses. And as you drive around Forsyth County, and I don't think many of us see that many houses and that many apartments going up. We see a lot in downtown, but then that doesn't represent anywhere near 4,600. This basically, we built, Linwood Davis is in the back of the room. He built 48 units out by Haynes Mall. We would have to build 100 of those just to keep up with the growth that we've had in the last 10 years. And it's that type of numbers. My wife always kind of says whenever I start throwing numbers around, people can't visualize numbers. So I've tried to make it visualized. This is actually, if you look at downtown Winston-Salem, if we built apartments and we build them at 14 per acre, which is really dense, compared to what most North Carolina's built, this yellow line, which is basically all of downtown, is just the amount of apartments we need from the growth from the last 10 years. So if we wiped out all of downtown and just put apartments, that's how many apartments we need. Same time, this is single-family housing. This is all of Ardmore. It's basically from downtown Winston-Salem to the campus we're on right now, at Forsyth Tech. That's how many houses we would have to build if we had 6 per acre. When you add those two together, you start realizing we got a big issue, the thought that we're going to be building this much housing in that short of a period of time. This yellow line actually represent all the rental and the houses we would have to build from the growth from the last 10 years. At the same time, we have projections that the next 10 years we're growing the exact same amount that we've just done for the last 10 years. So we're going to have to get another one of these yellow circles. We're going to have to build just for the new people coming that's not even fulfilling the ones we have today. It's basically, and I know Mayor Joines came up with, he wants to do 700 and some units a year. When you actually do the math, for Forsyth County, we need 460 new apartments a year. So we're going to need one of these Texas Donuts, probably two of these Texas Donut buildings. And normally people say, what's a Texas Donut? Well, actually, the big complexes that are downtown are called Texas Donuts. They traditionally go right to the street with stacked apartments underneath, or parking underneath, and then apartments on top. We basically need two of those a year. And we've been getting a good amount downtown, but we're not getting two of those a year for Forsyth County. As well as we need 900 new houses being built every year, just to keep up with the volume. The second thing that's happening is basically the housing is getting very old. I got the flag here. But basically, when you look at the breakdown of how much housing's been built, we had that period of time, which we're showing in the drawings, where we had this 1950s, 60s kind of period of time where things were being built at the pace of how the population was growing. We basically are back in the situation. When I started doing this, I started doing housing when I was 22 years old, right out of college, back in the 80s. And we used to look around North Carolina and say, we're never running out of land. And I think all of our design is basically based upon 1970s rules still, with the idea that we just have endless amount of land. But as you speak with the city and anybody else who's on the putting utilities in this and putting the streets in, we don't have an endless amount of land. So we need to start working on more density. Another challenge we have is that building residential is getting more and more difficult every year. At the same time, there's other uses that are really easy to basically convert land. None of these on these slides am I picking on any of these organizations, because this is just part of growth of metropolitan areas. But storage units are really easy to get approved. They basically you don't have to do any special approvals. There's not many NIMBYs out there who are saying, I don't want a storage unit building beside me. There's a little bit. They don't require any parking. They almost have no water uses, so they don't have to worry about the shortage of water. And so they're very easy to build. So on a 5-acre piece of land, you can quickly build one of these. At the same time, they're hugely profitable. You can make more money on a storage unit than you can storing people in an apartment building. So that's why they are built related to it. At the same time, we've had a good amount of our housing stock is now being Airbnb'd. That's the component that nobody really takes into account, is we're losing housing stock because of that. Both of these are very profitable entities. Number 4 is basically, yes, here, Andrea.
Switching mics again.
Sorry, and I can
to give you a sense of what the difference between a rental. My parents are looking at coming and spending some time. Turn off the mic. Okay. Now I'm on. So my parents are looking at coming and spending some time in Winston Salem, and they're looking for a 3-month VRBO. It would cost them more to do 3 months of a VRBO than to rent a 12-month lease in one of the Texas Donuts. That's how profitable the VRBOs are for people who own those properties. And we are losing homes that people used to live in to investors who are buying housing in our neighborhoods and converting them to VRBOs, right? Which not only takes housing out of the market, it also changes the nature of our neighborhoods. Vacation rentals by owner. So, sorry.
No, that works. Number 4 is actually us. It's the boomers and millennials, both of which are the biggest populations that we have. We got 75 million boomers. And just so everybody knows, these are slides that basically have been adapting over time. And when I started 3 years ago, kind of giving these slides to different organizations and different churches and other ones, they've changed. The boomers, basically, we have a lot of boomers. And when I say a lot, if you have 10% of a generation decides that they want to downsize and they want to live in very small houses, which are usually entry-level houses for people right out of college or people right out of school, and you're deciding that, hey, let's move into a 1,400 square foot house, right now you lost a unit for some of the younger folks. And at the same time, boomers are in this downsizing mode, which is right now, I always kind of call it de-yarding, because most of this is they get the same size house, but they get a very small yard. But then we have the millennials, and this slide's actually changed. I used to say the millennials thought it was cool to rent. And then I had a lot of millennials after these meetings come up to me and say, I just can't afford a house. I would love to have a house, but I rent because I have to. At the same time, as the millennials are getting older, they traditionally would be stepping into entry-level houses. And based upon school loans and other stuff, that whole generation, which is 95 million people, are not moving to the traditionally going out of rental housing apartments and moving into single-family houses, mainly because they can't afford it, and also because the boomers are deciding they want to live in the smaller neighborhoods and they want to be back into the downtowns, which is wonderful for us in Winston-Salem to see our downtown, but we have a lot of folks who are all saying, hey, it's really cool to be downtown now, which is driving that portion of it.
And I just want to add, that is why we see a lot of displacement going on, especially in the East Winston area. You see a lot of apartment and homes that the rent is doubling. People are no longer accepting Section 8, and that's because the housing market is just where they can decide if they want to accept it or not. It's more lucrative to not accept it, so that's their bottom line. So that's what we're seeing here with the changing.
Yeah. And this slide's an interesting one because it's, yes.
Back when you probably was trying to get a house or home, our neighborhoods look awful, and most of the people that own our houses in those neighborhoods don't even live in North Carolina.
Well, and it's one of the big challenges because we do neighborhood meetings, and we've noticed when we're working on properties, we used to do a neighborhood meeting. We would set up a tent, we'd have all the neighbors come over, and we've been finding more and more communities when we're building new properties that we find out there's two people who own the whole neighborhood. And all the people who are there are renters now. And you'll see on one of the slides coming up here kind of how that's changed. I think another thing that's an extra twist from the traditional model, which is people follow jobs, which is this is the demographics for the folks who are coming to North Carolina. Two of these categories, basically, I don't need to read down them, but basically family, job, retirement, lifestyle is the big four. Two of those have nothing to do with where they're based on. It's retirement and it's lifestyle. So they're picking cool places. They're picking, Asheville, and they're picking Winston-Salem we keep showing up as one of the great places to retire. The puzzle with that is that's, let's see if we can click here. That's making it different. That puts a lot of people into where the jobs are really growing. At the same time, there we go. At the same time, we have this dynamics, and I'm throwing some numbers here, but basically here's the big concepts. People coming to North Carolina, we have 114,000 new people moving to North Carolina every year, and that's across all the different metros. What's interesting about this is the ages. When you look at the 54 and above, that's like 60% or almost 60% of the folks moving to North Carolina are seniors. They only make up about 40% or a little less than 40% of the U.S. population, but 60% of the people moving to North Carolina are seniors. The second section, and I'll point out, second section is actually the other thing that's throwing off a lot of the dynamics right now, is basically the folks moving to North Carolina. We have like almost 60, 70% of the folks have incomes above $100,000, and a good chunk of folks who are moving here that have incomes that are over $150,000. And to put that in perspective, our median income for Winston-Salem is $77,000. So you have folks who are moving to North Carolina who have twice as much income and have twice as much ability to buy things based upon that.
Can I add something right there?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to add also the flip side of that is those that are making under 75 are, a lot of them are leaving the area. So that means we're losing a lot of the job market. A lot of the people that can no longer afford here, that means that they will no longer be in that position. So we have to also look at that factor as well.
I think the other thing is, and it's just that's the bigger term, but also what I really watch is the 18 to 35 group, because that's the future for the state. That's a lot of the people that are going to work. And I was at a panel probably 8 years ago with a bunch of banks, and they were all trying to figure out how we're going to work with millennials. And then basically one of them said, 75% of the workforce is millennials. You're going to have to work with them. It's the same thing. The puzzle we have on some of the demographics is we have a lot of younger folks leaving North Carolina. And I think if you took out of the statistics, took out Raleigh and Charlotte in the dynamics, we would really have this kind of sucking sound. I've worked with a couple cities that's their whole thing is how do we keep our kids? And when they refer to kids, they're not referring to like 8-year-olds. They're trying to figure out how to get their kids to graduate from college, come back into these communities. And right now, that is the big challenge, because you have a young woman who graduates from NC State with an engineering degree, and she's trying to get a job in Statesville or some of these other communities, and she's trying to figure out where she lives. I mean, that's the question I ask all these cities is, okay, that 27-year-old, where's she going to live? And unfortunately, most of the answer is she's going to buy a house, which was the answer 30 years ago. But in today's market, that's not the one, she can't afford it. And then two, it's just the lifestyle is different than it was 50 years ago. This is number, it's covered, but I think this is number 5. This is actually the median incomes for a family of 4. And I'm not getting into the graphs at all, so nobody worry about math here. But basically, this shows Charlotte. Charlotte's over the last 10 years, you can see the blue lines kind of over the last 10 years. You can see it's grown quite a bit. Its median income is $96,000. Raleigh is now actually up at $110,000. But they've had a dramatic, you can have the Great Recession, which kind of flattened it there. And then as soon as they came out of the Great Recession, the incomes have just completely gone straight up. This is let's see if we can do it. There we go. This is Winston-Salem, Forsyth County. This is 20 years. We are flat. And this is a sad statement. Basically, our median income right now is $77,000, which is basically just the last year. We grew about $12,000 or $14,000 higher. We're all still trying to figure out if that's just a statistical anomaly or whether that's an actual trend. But we actually, you figure for 20 years, the median income for a family of 4 stayed exactly almost the same spot, which basically says that families did not have additional money in order to pay for additional rent. And without being able to pay additional rent, you don't have builders wanting to build stuff or for new houses to be built.
And at the same time, incomes are staying flat during this period. Rents are going up, utilities are going up, food prices are going up. Like everything's going up in cost except what people are earning, right? What gives them less power to purchase housing.
And this is one of the discussions that come out. I'm participating in Winston-Salem Rise, and that's been a wonderful group to talk about. And we've realized, well, I'm part of a housing group there too, so there's lots of us people who like to do this in the evening. But at the same time, that's been the bigger puzzle is we keep trying to strip these back, and you have housing and income, and then you can open us up into a whole lot, so many different issues that cause this. But at the same time, as part of Folks for Good Housing, we're going to try to keep it really into the housing portion of it because there's so many other people trying to figure out how do we make the incomes and how do we address education and medical and all the other challenges that we have at the moment. This is also another slide. Don't worry about the math. But it's one of ones to kind of explain the different, we're going to use some terminology. The yellow section is people who are making between 10 and 30% of area median income. And Rod was going to remind me that I need to, for area median income, talk about it. Area median income is basically statistically comes out each year. It's done off of census data and also surveys. And what they do is issue a amount of money that folks would make as the middle of the median would be 100%. The median income is 77 for us right now. Traditionally, the yellow section here would be what we'd call subsidized housing. That's traditionally your Section 8. It's emergency housing, which is Andrea's world, fits into that. We have the blue section, which is really 40% up to like 60% of area median income, which is what we call workforce housing. And has a very active program, the low-income housing tax credit program. It's been really strong program that cities and states are using. That's kind of worked in this blue section quite a bit. Not enough. We don't have enough credits to make everything work. But that's the blue section. You then end up in this section when I'll probably jump to the green, which is the folks who are in the green section are folks who can basically spend less than a third of their income for housing, whether it's apartments or whether it's housing in the traditional buying a single family house or a townhouse. And then we end up with this red section, which is the missing middle. And the missing middle used to be just a small band. As housing, both on the rental cost side and also the for sale housing keeps going up, the red section is getting to be bigger and bigger, which is folks who just have to spend more than 50% of their income for housing. And that's basically the definition of the missing middle, is that folks are now starting to have to spend to get into, because they don't have any assistance on any way, but they still have to buy into these markets and figure out creative ways to live and pay for that. I think this is a slide that we came up with recently. I'm still practicing on this one, so if somebody afterwards says that didn't work, then we'll come up with a new one. But this is basically what we're looking at. The yellow is our basically our subsidized housing. That's really your 10 to 30% of median income. The green is actually workforce housing, and then the blue is actually people who are at area median income. What's happened basically in this second section is we've added 2 new people to based upon all these folks coming to North Carolina and moving from other locations within the state to Forsyth County, and we've only added 1 additional house. So we've all of a sudden we have 2 new people percentage wise, and we have 1 new house, and basically. We had the School of Government gave us a 20-minute discussion on this, and I'm trying to just put it into a slide. And it's an interesting and troubling path, because basically what's happened is those 2 new people have taken up the new housing, because all the new apartments and all the new houses are on the high end. We really don't have anyone building for the low end of the housing and the renter side. So they basically have taken the additional house that's been created. At the same time, some of them have said, hey, let's downsize and let's save some rent and let's move into some workforce housing. So we now have the folks who have more income are basically moving into workforce housing road. So we've lost a house based upon that, which is that greenhouse that's down there. At the same time, the workforce housing people who traditionally have fit into our market, even though they're growing, have now basically said, well, I can't afford my apartment, which is the example in the back of the room here, actually, which is that my rent's just doubled because somebody else is willing to pay double for my apartment that I've lived in for 20 years. And so they're ending up having to search for more and more apartments, and they're ending up basically moving into what we call naturally occurring affordability housing, which is over there which was some of those yellow boxes that we had there. So Kevin's with the housing authorities back here. That would have been traditionally where folks would have moved with Section 8 vouchers and some of the other great tools that we have. Now, all of a sudden, we have folks who are workforce folks deciding that we'll rent those units that used to be Section 8 units, we'll rent them ourselves and also raise the rent on it. So now we have that blue box which is now converted from a traditionally naturally occurring affordable, has now been cleaned up, or most of the time not even cleaned up, just charge more rent. And what we result in is basically now we have even more folks on the workforce housing taking up apartments. And then we end up with this situation, which is we end up with a third of our Section 8 or our traditionally on the subsidized housing side is not, it doesn't exist in Winston Salem and Forsyth County anymore.
Well, just if I can jump in, Richard. So for those of you who made comments or are interested in what's happening with people who are homeless in our community, that's where they're coming from, right? But what you'll notice is we started in our conversation, as Winston-Salem has sort of studied the housing problem, we're estimating we're about 14,000 units short, right? But we only have about 500 people experiencing literal homelessness on the street or in shelters on any given night, about 1,200 different people coming through the homeless system per year. So the real question is, where's everybody going if they're not in our shelters or on our streets, right? And this again impacts our housing, right? Where they're going is they're doubling up, which means that they're putting more stress on our lower income housing. A lot of people are living in hotels. And that, right? So we see people living, families of 4, families of 6 living in single hotel rooms so that they stay off of the street. And that's what's happening to people. So we don't actually see homelessness in our community to the extent that people are experiencing a housing crisis.
And basically, underneath the chat box is the result is we have part of our population is actually doesn't fit into housing right now. And basically, it's where people are referring as displacement taking place. And it's not something where it's as evident as when you look at Oakland or San Francisco or some of the other ones out west where people have tents on the streets. But we have that same situation. So often we were looking at new properties and people are in tents in the woods. And then we didn't see that. We didn't see that 5 years ago. That's pretty much across the state. You see that. Anytime it's close to an urban area and there's trees, there's people in the woods. Okay, number 6 is actually construction costs have greatly increased. This is dramatic in the sense that we're working on Peters Creek on actually replacing the budget inn, which at one point was actually emergency housing. There was a lot of people living in that permanently in budget inn. The goal is actually to replace what was substandard housing with 62 new apartments in that location. And we've been actively working on that. The building we're planning on putting into that location, we built in Hickory 16 months ago. And the price to build that property right now is 40% more 16 months later. So that dramatic will change related to construction costs itself. At the same time, we have additional things such as stormwater and other costs that wasn't even something that when you build houses or apartments you had to deal with before that are now becoming, and there's good reasons why some of these things are being implemented. At the same time, they're very costly things that somebody has to pay for, whether that's the buyer of the home or whether that's an apartment renter in that sense. The state and the cities are continuing to try to pass all the new costs off to the newest housing. This is basically was part of the rules that came out of Raleigh was that individual cities are supposed to be allocating the new utility costs to every new house that comes across. Well, like water meters went from basically $50 to get a water meter and literally went to $3,500 overnight. I mean, that dramatical of a change. And when you look at it, that means what type of housing can afford $3,500 additional costs? It's just the very high-end stuff, because when you're talking about kind of the missing middle and some of those other ones, they're just barely trying to figure out how to build something versus trying to have extra money to throw it in. I think all these things add up quite a bit.
And Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, right? When you're building a single family house, you buy one water meter at $3,500 a unit. If you're building a 100-unit apartment complex, you're buying 100 water meters at $3,500.
Yes.
Right. So, right, the multifamily, it's another discouragement of investing in multifamily housing.
This is a perfect example, and I'm don't take any of this that I'm bashing the city or the state for trying to do stormwater, because there's some reasons why they're trying to do it. At the same time, the trying to come up with the reasons of why we have a housing issue, we need to look at this stuff straight on. This is actually Linwood Davis's stormwater pond for 48 units. To build 48 units, he has $350,000 worth of stormwater pond that 5 years ago wasn't even required by a thing. And that doesn't seem like you figure, okay, this is an $8 million transaction. They can absorb $350,000. But every dollar that's additional has to get passed on to, you need to get a loan that's bigger. Therefore, you have to have higher rents, which means you have to charge more to the tenants. This was an example. I had a city council member ask me, okay, well, that's $350,000 is a lot, but how does that affect the tenants? Basically, that's adding additional cost of $1,900 for the apartment complex. But then in reality, the tenants are going to pay for it. So every one of those tenants in that building are paying $50 a month for the stormwater pond. And to put that in perspective, the permits and other fees, which are traditionally what everybody thought was the thing you tried to ask the city to not do, is $48,000. So you're basically paying, a very small number for the traditional permit fees and other things. But then these additional ask and other compliance things that we have to do are adding a lot to the cost of these apartments, which is causing the naturally occurring type properties not to be built. Number 8 is actually the federal and state funds have been getting cut back quite a bit. As we were talking about earlier in the history of housing, there was all these programs from the 1920s, 40s, 50s that all rolled out. And then basically Section 8 and the different HUD programs that were the 70s, 80s, which created a lot of housing, whether you like it or not. It created a lot of housing within this community and also within the United States. All that basically in the 1990s, the federal government decided that it wanted to get out of housing, which is why they shut down the Section 8 programs and shut down a lot of the other programs that they were doing and basically privatized it at that point. And they've been spending the last 30 years basically trying to get all this housing that was subsidized to get it out of the expense of the federal government. And so that is basically has been first hit the market rate Section 8 complexes. So a lot of these ones that you see they're boarded up are not boarded up just because they couldn't operate. It's basically that they were slowly put out of business. And then recently now the federal government is spending time and energy going after all the housing authorities to basically do the same thing with them, which is what they call the RAD program, which was basically a program for them to get a one-time severance package is the way I look at it, which is here's some cash, figure out how to do the property after this, but we're not going to be involved in it anymore is basically the way the program was. The state folks in Raleigh also decided recently they had a $20 million workforce housing loan program that was very active in making new apartments happen, which was $250,000 to almost $1.5 million per property. And they basically decided not to put that in the budget, and it went out 2 years ago. But each one of these things kind of adds up. So every time you remove another layer of this different assistance, basically the only way you can go is you're going to have to collect more money from your tenants. And that's really why we're seeing the increase in rents coming up quite a bit is just to be able to afford to build new things.
Well, I think the other thing, and I alluded to a little bit earlier, that we're seeing in the housing market, particularly coming out of the pandemic, for us in Winston-Salem, it's been having in other communities across the country earlier, is that housing has become an investment, not just for me as a homeowner, but for investors, right? So there are investor conglomerates that have companies, they buy up housing in communities, they don't live here, right? They're not even a person, they're a corporation, and they buy up housing, and all it is for them is a profit margin, right? So how little can I pay for this house and how much rent can I charge? And that rent doesn't stay in our community, it leaves our community, right? And goes to investors across the country. And so what we're seeing is, right, so where pre-pandemic, we had many more Winston-based owners of rental housing. What we are seeing is a consolidation of rental housing into a handful of corporations that aren't Winston-based, right? So outside of our community owners of properties, they are jacking up rents. They are not investing in rehabilitating properties. So we're seeing declining housing quality at the same time that we're seeing increasing rents. And the other thing that we're seeing is when we have a lot of mom and pop owners of property, they're renting not just for income to themselves, but they're investing in their community and they have relationships with their tenants. These large corporate interests have no relationships with their tenants, right? So you are late 5 days on your rent, they file an eviction, right? So we're seeing a lot more evictions a lot faster for people. A lot more just cut and dry policies of like, if you don't do what we want you to do, you're out. So we're seeing a lot more churn in the rental market. And every time there's turnover in the rental market, they jack the rents up, right? And so that's also adding more and more pressure on the rental market and the rates of increase in rent prices.
Well, and I think that's one of the things I always kind of find interesting, because when I am going into new cities to build apartments, and we'll have somebody say, is this going to be HUD housing? I mean, that's the question I always get. And it's so interesting because I always kind of answer is no. Actually, most of HUD housing right now is actually the Texas Donuts luxury housing that's downtown. Those are all 221D4 programs, and HUD's actually now rolling out a new pilot program to start trying to do affordable again, because they were getting kind of slapped around quite a bit politically, because all of a sudden they're funding the most expensive housing in the United States is basically all HUD financed right now. And so they're going under pressure right now to try to they have a pilot program that we're participating in to try to use their new program just to kind of save them a little grief related to it.
I think that the other thing that we're seeing, right, in many of these developments, they may get subsidy or investment from the city or the county or the state or HUD with some requirement for housing to be affordable, but there's no requirement that they accept housing subsidies. So what's happening is people who have subsidies now can't find anyone who will take their subsidy, right? So one of the challenges we're seeing in our supportive housing programs is we have vouchers to pay rent for people, but no one will accept them, right? And, you know, pre-pandemic, one of our challenges was we could find housing that would accept the rents, but the tenants didn't necessarily want to live in those neighborhoods. Now we can't even find housing. Right, so we have unused vouchers, not because people don't want or need them, but because we don't have the housing supply that will accept those vouchers.
Okay, and then we end up with the slide summarizing kind of the 8. Big macro, as you folks start participating in our discussions and kind of this, is we've started from the beginning of saying we're not going to sit around and whine about all this stuff all the time. Our goal is basically to, one, identify the challenges that we have out there, but then 2, try to, figure out what the challenges are, and then try to come up with some tools that can help alleviate some of these things. So we really end up with populations grown quite a bit. We have a lot of aging housing stock that's leaving the market just because it's too old. We have a lot of other uses for land which are really easily done. We have boomers and millennials are kind of throwing off the dynamics of the traditional housing market. We have incomes that are stagnant. We have construction costs that are doubling. We have government passing more expenses to new housing, and the federal government decided not to be in housing anymore, which all sounds pretty dismal. At the same time, there's some positives out there. There's also challenges. This is what we're ending up with, and I'm not picking on Link at all, but that's just, they have a pretty picture on their website. But basically, this is right up from the budget in. Transaction we're working on right now, a 1-bedroom is now almost $1,500 for a 1-bedroom. Put this in perspective, and Kelly Mitter's out here with Habitat. When we first did this slide, I updated these slides. This actually was $1,100 18 months ago. It's now almost $1,500 for a 1-bedroom. A 2-bedroom is actually $1,600, and this is actually the starting point. This is the teaser rate to get you to come in and look at them. And in reality, the rents are quite a bit more than that.
And to put this in perspective, HUD, for all of its subsidized housing programs, for the voucher programs, sets what's called a fair market rate, which is the rate they'll pay for a unit on a housing voucher. For a 1-bedroom unit, fair market rate is about $650. Right? So all of our folks that we're trying to get housed out of homelessness who have vouchers or who have subsidy, right, are competing with a $650 voucher against $1,400 a month rents. And that's why we're having a hard time housing folks.
And then the second thing we have is single family houses. I put $400,000 plus in here, but as we reviewed the slides, everybody's saying, good luck trying to find a new house for $400,000, unless you're in a traditional neighborhood where you're doing 6 per acre. I think there's some more denser, and that's part of the discussions we're going to have in subsequent is trying to come up with some other ways to basically have single family houses, whether it's more denser or as in townhouses or cottage courts or other types of things like that. Yes, go ahead.
People? Are there 2 young people in those apartments? I mean, do y'all have any information on that?
Yeah, actually, I follow it quite a bit. I think we have folks who are making a conscious lifestyle choice and saying, I'm going to spend 50% of my income on better housing. So I have a swimming pool and I have the ability to walk to the bars and all the stuff that kind of works with the Texas Donuts. You have folks who just don't have a choice. We have a good amount of students. So that's been one of the puzzles of the naturally occurring affordable is we have students and grad students who are renting a lot of the affordable units because they're in school right now and they qualify for it. But they're a full-time student. And at the same time, when you look at 350, because I always get this question, which is everyone's going, I'll be glad when the luxury housing can't rent any of their units and they start having vacancies and they'll start lowering their rents. And I always kind of say that's never happening because we have 350,000 people in our metro. And even if you take 1% of that, that's a huge number of people who can fill up. Actually, in my circle of yellow circle around there, we could build luxury apartments probably for one of those whole yellow circles and have enough people to live in it. At the same time, that same group is throwing off the dynamics. And I'm not kind of bashing on anybody who decides to live downtown in one of those buildings because they're a good option, but we have to figure out how to fill in some of the other places for people. But that's generally what's happening is we have really a bracketed system where we have a lot of folks who make a good amount of money and we have a lot of folks who make a low amount of money. And Andrea and some of the United Way folks always remind me we have almost 30% people living in poverty in Forsyth County, which brings in our statistics quite a bit.
Right. So the other thing, just in that home ownership market, where Richard's showing you these $400,000 houses, we were looking at the housing for sale housing market the other day, and on the MLS, there were no houses for sale. I mean, 0 houses for sale between $100,000 and $400,000. And right, that's the other problem in our housing market, right? So we have people who want to leave rental housing, purchase a home, and there's nothing that's affordable to them on the market to purchase. And part of the problem that's happening is, as I mentioned, these corporations that are buying up housing, they're coming in and not only buying apartment buildings, they're buying single family homes and turning them into rental homes. And they're paying cash down and can close transactions very quickly, and they're often paying over asking price because they know they can recoup it in the higher rents.
And there's no regulation available to us for those buyers.
There really isn't.
I mean,
it's a free market. It's the other sad story that's actually come out quite a bit is HUD and Freddie and Fannie, which are all owned by the federal government, has been financing these big groups. They've had a couple pilot programs with Berkshire Hathaway and a couple of the really huge hedge funds, and basically financing. Well, they'll take 5,000 houses, roll them into one mortgage, and then finance them at really low interest rates so they can't compete. So when you have that 26-year-old who's graduated from NC State trying to buy her first house, she's competing with a hedge fund that actually has, a couple $1 billion set aside for them at really low interest rates. And so that's been one of the big challenges. I know it's going to be part of our discussion when we do single family houses.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is different communities can put in different regulations, right? So there are some communities around the country that are now putting in regulations around source of income discrimination, right? So right now, landlords, if you have a housing voucher and can pay the rent, and they don't want to take the housing voucher, they don't have to, right? But with legislation that says you're not allowed to discriminate on the source of someone's income, right? Landlords would be prohibited from discriminating against housing voucher holders, right? And so that's part of the conversation we hope to have over the next several months is what is right for us to ask for in our community to help us create the housing market that we want to have.
And actually, this slide shows that based upon your guys' earlier slide, kind of we had this tradition every 10 years, we were adding, this is Forsyth County's numbers. We were basically adding 25 or so thousand new housing units, and that's a combination of single family houses and apartments. Every decade, we were getting 25,000. From 2000 to 2020, we got 11,000. So we basically got half as many units being built. At the same time, our population did not slow down whatsoever. So I think this is the biggest indicator. This is one of these ones where we have to open our eyes and say, this is what's the result last decade, but we have to try to figure out for the next decade, how do we change this? Because if we use the traditional six houses per acre and kind of the density and other rules that we have set up, we're going to keep ending up with 11,000 each year or each 10 years, and we're going to be having a bigger issue when we all get together for folks for good housing 2030. This is another change, and this is actually what Andrea was just referring to. There's 93,000 homes that are owned in Forsyth County. One of the statistics that came up from the School of Government when they gave their presentation to the City Council was that we are in the top 3 cities in North Carolina for how many houses we have per person. We're right behind Cary, and there's like two other cities that have this ratio of how many housing to apartments in that sense. So over the last 10 years, we've only increased houses and this is basically houses that are owned. We've only increased 3%, which is a pretty small number compared to the amount of population that we've grown. At the same time, we've increased 17% on rentals. And this is a combination. It's not that we're overbuilding apartments. That's kind of putting this in there. This is the change from single-family home ownership to single-family rentals that we're seeing across the country actually right now.
Can we take a breath just for a minute? I feel like we've done a massive information dump on everybody. And I don't know what's going through your minds. Would love for you to jot down on any of your notepads that are on your table. But my thoughts go immediately to the people that this is affecting on a daily basis. And they are our neighbors. They are our church members that we attend church with or see at the park. They're people that we care about and love. Workforce housing might sound like a laborer. Workforce housing, some teachers cannot afford to pay for workforce housing. So sort of letting all that sink in and understanding how it impacts people. And if there's an impact, either you're feeling or we would love to capture those stories. We want you to be influencers. We want you to have a voice because that's the only way that we're going to get anybody's attention is if all of us as a community can kind of come together and understand the issue and then understand the options we have to start addressing the problem and engaging our leaders to help address the problem.
Hi, this is Richard with Folks for Good Housing. Thanks for joining us on this discussion of housing in Forsyth County, Winston-Salem. Please join us for future meetings.